even very skeptical ones, that's precisely what they do. Even though they don't believe it's the Word of God or inerrant in any respect, they still believe that they can find historical truths within it. Now, what's nice, Ali himself acknowledges this in his book, In Defense of Islam. He writes, although the present-day Bible is not the Word of God, elements of truth still exist within its text. So, even though Ali and I disagree on the Bible being inspired and inerrant, we both agree that the Bible contains truth. The question is, what criteria is Ali and I, what are we going to use? What criteria are we going to use for identifying that truth? Now again, I want to hasten to say, without apology, I believe the Bible is the inspired and inerrant Word of God. However, I'm not going to be approaching it that way this evening, because that is not tonight's debate. And so I can't ask you to give the Bible a privileged position. And I'm not going to grant a privileged position to the Quran either. So if Ali were to say, well, the reason that we should believe this is because, well, the Quran says that I believe it and that settles it for me, or the Quran is God's holy word, that's not going to fly for debate. You've got to show evidence for what your position is. And thus I'm going to do that as well for the Bible or for what I'm establishing. So I'm not out to establish that the Bible is inspired or inerrant, but I'm out to establish the points that I'm going to make in order to build a historical case using the criteria professional historians would use for establishing the death and resurrection of Jesus. Because in the end, I would just hope that, as the moderator said, that we would try, both Christians and Muslims, for the next hour and a half, to shed our biases and to try to look at things as objectively as possible. Because even as Tom Cruise said in the movie A Few Good Men, it doesn't matter what I believe, it only matters what I can prove. Now, I want to make one further observation before proceeding. This debate concerns the first century fate of Jesus. It is not a debate on the character of Muhammad. It is not on the question, Islam a religion of peace. It is not on, does the atonement make sense theologically? And it's not on the inerrancy or inspiration of the New Testament. These are all important issues, but they are not the subject of tonight's debate. And if we're not careful, we will get off topic and not be able to cover our topic adequately. So let's start now by looking at our 4 facts for which there is strong historical evidence. In fact, it's so strong that the majority of today's scholars regard them as historical facts, including skeptical ones. Fact number 1 is Jesus' death by crucifixion. Let me provide 2 reasons why we can be confident that Jesus died as a result of being crucified. First, it is reported by a number of sources, both Christian and non-Christian, and that are ancient. Josephus, Tacitus, Lucian, Marbar, Serapion all mention the event. Second, the chances of surviving crucifixion were very, very bleak. A number of ancient sources describe the ancient practices of scourging and crucifixion. For example, Josephus tells of a man who had been whipped so severely that he was filleted to the bone. He also mentions a group of Jewish men who were whipped until their intestines were laid bare. A 2nd century text named the Martyrdom of Polycarp tells of how the Roman whip was said to expose a person's veins and arteries. The person was then forced to carry their crossbeam outside the city walls, where soldiers, using nails, much like the one I'm holding in my hand, this is a replica of the nail discovered in the remains of the only crucified victim ever found in Jerusalem, a guy named Yehohanan. And so using nails like this, they would impale a man to a cross or a tree. And then the victim was left hanging in excruciating pain. In fact, the word excruciating comes from the Latin, out of the cross. Seneca, a 1st century lawyer and Roman philosopher, described crucified victims as having battered and ineffective carcasses, maimed, misshapen, deformed, nailed, and drawing the breath of life amid long, drawn-out agony. Only one account exists of a person surviving crucifixion in antiquity. Josephus reported seeing 3 of his friends crucified. So he appealed to his friend, the Roman commander Titus, who ordered that all three be removed immediately and provided the best medical care Rome had to offer. In spite of this, two of the three still died. Thus, even if Jesus had been removed prematurely and medically assisted, his chances of survival, at least by natural causes, are very bleak. So, taking the theistic equation out of the theistic component out of the equation for a moment, we can see that there is fantastic evidence for Jesus' death by crucifixion. In fact, even the atheist New Testament critic, Gerd Ludemann, writes, Jesus' death as a consequence of crucifixion is indisputable. Now, I realize that Muslims believe that God can do anything and that he made it only appear that Jesus died, according to Surah 4, verses 157 and 58. Well, Christians have always believed that God can do anything. But the question isn't what God can do. The question is what God did. And as far as the historical evidence is concerned, unless we have sufficient, adequate historical evidence to the contrary, well, the historian must conclude that Jesus was crucified and that the process killed him. Fact number 2 is the empty tomb. Let me provide 3 reasons why we can be confident that Jesus' tomb was empty. First is the Jerusalem factor. Jesus was publicly executed and buried in Jerusalem, and then his resurrection was proclaimed there publicly. So it would have been impossible for Christianity to get off the ground in Jerusalem if his body was still in the tomb. The Roman and Jewish authorities would have only had to visit the tomb and view the corpse, and the misunderstanding was over. There is no evidence that this occurred. In fact, the response of the Jewish leadership was quite different. And that leads us to my second reason. The Jewish leaders were reporting that the disciples of Jesus had stolen the body. This is reported by Justin Martyr and Tertullian, corroborating, these are outside reports corroborating a similar report by Matthew. And it seems to be an attempt to account for a missing corpse. It was just like the 10-year-old who tells his teacher that the dog ate his homework. You wouldn't say this if you had it to turn in. And likewise, you wouldn't claim that the disciples of Jesus had stolen his body if it was still in the tomb. This information from unsympathetic reports is very powerful in the eyes of historians. Paul Meyer, distinguished professor of ancient history at Western Michigan University, states the following: Jewish polemic shared with Christians the conviction that the sepulchre was empty, but gave natural explanations for it. And such positive evidence within a hostile source is the strongest kind of evidence. The third reason we can be confident about the empty tomb is because the claim of resurrection infers an empty tomb. What did I do there? Okay, it infers an empty tomb. The first Christians were Jews, and Jews held a variety of views regarding the afterlife. There were the Sadducees, who didn't believe in life after death. Rather, they held that when you died, that was it, no heaven. So they were sad, you see. Other Jews, like Josephus and Herod, held to a form of reincarnation. But the majority of Jews held that the body that dies is the same body that is raised and transformed into an immortal body. They call this resurrection. We see this in Isaiah, who writes, "Your dead will come back to life. Your corpses will rise up. Wake up and shout joyfully, you who live in the ground." Now this is all important because it helps us understand what the early Christians meant when they claimed that Jesus had been resurrected. They meant that the body that dies is the same body that is raised and transformed into an immortal, glorious, and powerful body that will never break down. And so, of course, this infers an empty tomb when they're saying that Jesus was resurrected. And you see, if he wasn't resurrected, and yet they still saw him in some sort of spiritual or ethereal, ghostly kind of state, they could have said that Jesus was somehow still alive, as Jesus himself had said, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob were still living. But they would not have said resurrection, a term that referred to bringing the corpse back to life. So we discovered that there's good evidence for the empty tomb, the Jerusalem factor, it's witnessed by Jesus' enemies, and the claim of resurrection infers an empty tomb. The historical Jesus scholar Geza Vermesh, who rejects the resurrection, writes the following: "When every argument has been considered and weighed, the only conclusion acceptable to the historian must be that the women who set out to pay their last respects to Jesus found to their consternation not a body, but an empty tomb. Fact number 3.